So it's lesson 12, and we've been working on setting up Recaptcha. But now we've got to add another little JavaScript here that will copy the Recaptcha response, which is generated by the API. It's invisible to us, but we want to copy it into the hidden input we've added. So we're going to use a little bit of JavaScript, additional JavaScript for this. So we'll add another script tag. And we can just put this script right on our register page. It doesn't need to go in our separate JS file because we're not using this script anywhere else, just on our register page. So the Recaptcha API, it generates a field called Recaptcha. So on the ready event, so when we get this Recaptcha response from the Google API, we want to copy that. We want to read the response we get back and put it in here. So we're then going to call Recaptcha.execute. And again, we need to put our site key in. So Google knows which site it's checking. And then we've got an action which we will call register. So I'll have to paste my site key in a minute. Then we call .then. And we get a token back. This is a response that comes from the Google API. So we're going to read the response we get back from Google, and we're going to copy it into that hidden input on line 29. So we use document.getElementID by ID. And then we're going to put this token, we're going to write it into our input. So we'll set the value. So there's our whole script. I'll put it in the chat, but you'll also need to replace, again, you'll copy your site key in here. So I'm going to copy my site key once again from the line above, and I'm going to replace it in this placeholder. So I've got my site key twice. First when I'm calling the API, linking to the API, and then when we're executing the Recaptcha API. We've got to pass in the site key both times. So there's the JavaScript we need in on our register page, the page where we have our form. I'm going to try it in Chrome for a second. Actually, if we wanted to see the response just for a second, we could do alert. We could try this, which would then pop up so we would know when Google's actually called, when it's called the API and sent us back a response. I'll just put this in here for a moment to see what happens. We can actually see it. So once this element is ready and calls the API, here's the response that we get from Google. It's all encrypted, so we can't read it. But when we register a new user, this response gets copied in to this hidden field, so we can read it on the next page. So I'm going to comment that out. I don't actually want that alert box there, just so we could actually see that the API is getting called and we're getting some kind of response back from it. So I'll take out that alert. So there's the code we need on this form to implement it. Our hidden field to store the response, our link to the API, and then our execution of the API to get a response. So there's our hidden field on line 29. Here's our link so we can use the API on line 34. And then our custom script that actually executes the Recaptcha call and gets some sort of response back, which we then put into the hidden part of our form. So our work on the register page is done. So now we need to write some code on our save page that interprets this response and decides whether the user is human or artificial. So we're going to go to our save registration page next. And we're going to write our Recaptcha code in here. We've already got validation for username, for password, but before we say things are okay, we now need our Recaptcha validation. So we need to set up a few variables. We need a variable to send the response to Google. We also need another variable for our secret key. So the site key that we've used here, it's public, right? If someone views the source of our page, they can actually see the public key, the site key. But our secret key goes in our server-side code. We don't want users to be able to read that. So we'll need a variable for our secret key, and then we'll have to get that input from our hidden field and send that to Google. So our first variable I'll call API URL, and it's going to be equal to google.com, Recaptcha, API, site verify. And this is from the API docs. So if we go and look at the documentation, which I'll pull up in a minute, on the Recaptcha site, it's going to say we need to send our requests to this URL. We don't transfer the browser. We're just going to make a hidden HTTP request in the background. We're going to call that URL. So that's going to be the same for all of us. If I click this See server-side integration, it tells us this is the URL we have to make our request to. google.com, Recaptcha API site verify. And there are 3 parameters, 2 of which are required. We need to supply our secret, and we need to supply the response, that hidden field in our form, which is the user response token provided by the client-side integration. If we want, we can also send in the user's IP address. That's what we send to the API, and this is what the API sends back. It will send us a JSON object with a success value of true or false, a challenge timestamp, and potentially any error codes. Oh, that's version 2. Hang on, we want version 3. So in version 3, we get a score. So if the score is 1.0, that means the API is certain it's a real person. If the score is 0.0, the API is certain it's a bot. And then there's a range in between. So our next variable is going to be the secret. Which we need to get from the Recaptcha console. So we've used the site key. We now need to copy our secret key. So I'm going to copy that. So there's the URL we're calling. Here's the secret key to identify our website. And our response is going to come from the hidden field on our form, which we called Recaptcha response. So we need to make a post request to this URL and send in the secret and the response. So then we want to make the API call and parse the JSON object we get back from Google. So I'll create a variable called API response. So we're not transferring our browser to this URL. We can actually make an HTTP request to it, a hidden request. And PHP has a simple method for doing this. There's a method called file get contents. So we're going to call our API URL. And we're going to add on our secret and our response. So make a call to the Google API, pass in our secret key and the Recaptcha response. I'll create one more variable. So this comes back, it's JSON. It's a JSON object that looks like this. So we need to parse it from JSON. So we're going to call JSON Decode. So this will convert the response to an array. So then we can read the values in the array. So we're going to check the score. If it's less than 0.5, it's probably a bot. So 0.0 equals bot, 1.0 equals human. So in this case, we'll say echo and we'll set OK to false. So now we're going to run this and see if we can register a new user or if the API is going to block us. So I'll put the code in the chat, but it has my key. So I'm going to replace that with a placeholder. So if the API works, it should recognize me as a person, which means it should allow me to sign up. Which it did. It didn't give me any error, which means the Recaptcha API recognized that I am a person and not a bot. Now, the other way we could test this, I should add one more check here, which is what if the success is equal to false? Let's say I put in an invalid key. So if I try it like this, I should also say if so if for any reason calling the API fails, so I'm just going to try it like this with an invalid key. In this case, my success should be false. I'll try this as well. So I'll go to register. Okay, so, oh, I shouldn't even check the score. We don't get a score if success is false, actually. So I'll move this inside. So I'm going to wrap this in an else. So if success is true, then we'll check the score. If success is false, we don't even have a score. So this validation's a little better. So I'll just go and try this one more time. It says, are you human when my key is invalid? If I put my secret key back, it should work again. So I'll put my key back in. And I should be able to sign up again. So now it works when my keys are correct. So first we're checking that we get a successful response. If we don't, we're going to throw an error. If success is true, we're then going to evaluate the score. If we're closer to the bot score, we're not going to let the user sign up. If we're closer to a human score, we'll then register our new user. So this is the typical process of consuming an API. We find a service we want to use. We read the documentation, which I didn't totally do because Google's documentation is a bit confusing. It's a little harder to implement. We register with the API and generate our keys. And then we have to integrate the code and test out the different scenarios. No matter what kind of API it is, a login API, a payment service API, typically APIs are documented. So they tell us how we use them and how we send requests and what kind of responses we would get back. So we've integrated two APIs, our weather API, which was really simple, just straight HTML and JavaScript, and the Google Recaptcha API, which is a little more advanced. We had to register for this one to generate our keys. We have to include our site key and our secret key in our code. And we have to make an explicit call to the API URL, which gives us a JSON object back, which we then have to interpret or parse, and then we can read the values inside. We also want to take a stab at making our own simple API today in our PHP gaming site. Before we do that, does anybody have questions about Recaptcha? I will publish all this code, but I think I've put it all in the chat anyway. To build our own API, what we want to do is we want to make our games data available as a JSON object so another application could use it. So we could build, a mobile app or a different type of application, and it could see what kind of games we have for sale. So an API, something like, well, let's just search here. We can find. So here, like the video game database API, let's have a look at this. I've never used it before. Right, it wants to make video game lists available. So it's available in JSON. Let's see, can we use it? So here, we want to see the top 100 games. So they have an API. So we want to get a list of games in JSON format. Let's see, which one we've got here. So we want to look up, let's say, a particular game. So there's a request path / games, and this is what the API gives us back. All of these fields in JSON format. There's game engines, right? So there's different methods in this API so we can get different things. We want to get a company, for example. So we're going to build our own. So in our project, I'm going to make a new directory called API. And in here, I'm going to make a new PHP file called games. In our page, we can take out all of the HTML because our APIs, there's no front end, there's no user interface. It's simply JSON data being passed back and forth. So we want a blank page with a set of PHP tags. So we'll want to connect to the database, write query to fetch games. We'll execute query and grab results. Using fetch assoc to include column names. And then we'll display the game array as a JSON object and just connect. So to connect, we'll just include or require our database file. Notice we need this path because we're in the API folder. So the database file is not in the same folder, right? We're in here, the database file is up one level in the root. So I need to prefix that path with .. Our query will be pretty simple. Well, we'll do games.star and publishers.name from games So we're going to connect them by publisher ID using a foreign key, right? Every game has a publisher. One publisher can have many games. Because this will get all the games, but it will also, our query is going to include, rather than just the publisher ID, it's also going to include the publisher name. So we'll prepare our query. We'll execute it. We're going to call fetch all, but we're going to use a different parameter this time. Which is fetch assoc. So this way it includes the column names. We need the column names in our JSON object because JSON always includes, right? It includes the column names as well as the values. So by using this fetch assoc, This will give us the column names that we need for our JSON object. So far, this is the only new thing in the file. The rest of this code we already have in our games.php. Connect, we've already got this query that includes the publisher name. We set up, run our query, and fetch the results. Then we want to convert this to JSON and display it. So we'll use JSON Encode. This not only prints the games, but it prints them in JSON format. I'm going to try it out. It looks okay so far, but we'll see. I'll put it up on Pastebin in a moment. Shrink this down so we can maybe try to look at it. You can see the code and the page all at once. So now the URL I'm going to go to is my PHP gaming /API/games.php. And what we get is a JSON representation that shows all our game data. I get an array, but it's in JSON format. Whoops, I have got an extra question mark here at the end I need to take out. Here. Going to try it in Chrome for just a minute. Right, and I've got a little JSON extension in Chrome, so it actually formats it nicely for me. So it's nice and readable. It even includes the publisher name because we've got this join. We've got the photos. So it generates this list of games as an API. I'll put this up on Pastebin. We're going to add one addition to it in just a moment. So we're still just running a regular query. The only things that we haven't done are when we call fetch all, we're using this fetch assoc to include our column names, and then we're encoding the data as a JSON object, which then renders it as an API. So some other application can query our database and fetch our game listing without that application having our username and password, and they can't connect into our database. They can only read the game data. They can't add, edit, or delete. It's read only. We can add one more little feature to this. So right now our API shows all of the games in the database. We want to modify it so that a user could also specify one publisher and only get the games by that publisher. So if I do something like this, so we can see in my database, I've got 2 games by Nintendo. So if I add a parameter like this, publisher equals Nintendo, I want to get the data, but I only want the games that Nintendo makes. I don't want to see the EA, the FromSoft, Activision, anything else. So we can add a check to our API that looks for a publisher get variable, and if it finds one, we're going to create a where clause to filter our query for the selected publisher only. So then our API could show all the games, or it could show one game. Show you a common example of what this might look like. I'll actually go here. Let's have a look at, even though it's music, not games, let's go to we'll just have a quick look at the Spotify API. So Spotify has a JSON API, so you can interact with it if you want to use Spotify data. So for example, we might have a, like there's an albums API. So we can get a list of albums. So here's the URL, api.spotify.com, version 1/albums. This returns a JSON object where you get a list of albums. But in this API, in the artists one, we can get artists. Just wondering if we can get, but if we pass in an ID, we get a single artist, and it might include, interesting, it doesn't include their albums. I thought maybe it would. Oh, we can get their top tracks. So the tracks that belong to one artist. So we're going to kind of mimic this API. If we pass in a publisher name, we want to get the games that are attached to it. So you can see how these APIs are also documented so we can consume them. So we will check for a publisher parameter. So we'll say if not empty. And this will be the last thing we're going to do with this. Publisher. We'll say publisher equals get publisher. And we'll initialize that variable to null in case there isn't any publisher. Somebody maybe just wants all the games in the database, so they're not going to give us a publisher. So we'll initialize it to null. If they put a publisher parameter in, so something like API games.php publisher equals. So if we have this value, we're going to take it and store it in our publisher variable. If we have a publisher, we need to add a where clause in our query, and we need to bind a parameter to pass that publisher name to the query. So we're going to check if our list should be selected for the filtered publisher. So we could say if not empty. So if we have a publisher variable, we're going to append on, we want to add on to our SQL. So in this case, we're going to add where publishers.name equals publisher. And make sure you start with a space here, because this is going to get added on at the end. So I've added the block from lines 8 to 10, as well as the block from line 17 to 19. And we're going to need one more check after line 22. If our publisher is not empty, we have a value in the URL, we then need to populate our parameter with this publisher variable. So after we prepare the command, but before we execute it, we need to fill publisher parameter if we have a selected publisher. The same if statement, if not empty. We're going to bind that parameter. We need to fill it and pass the publisher name, which is a 50-character string. So now the games API should work as it did before. If there is no publisher, it should show all the games. But if we add a publisher name on the end, our list should get filtered. Oops. Sorry. I'll put the whole thing up on Pastebin, and we want to try it in both scenarios. I want to make sure this code didn't break our API, which is working. So I'll just go to Pastebin. So I need to try this out. So if I refresh here, actually it's probably a little easier in Chrome. It's a little nicer. So with no publisher parameter, we get all the games. But if I want to add on publisher equals Nintendo, now it only returns the 2 games made by Nintendo. Say publisher equals EA. I get different data. I say publisher equals someone else. I just get an empty array because there are no games attached here. So now we've got this useful API. If we want to use our game data or share it somehow, make it available to some other kind of application, which is kind of what this site is doing. It's making different pieces of its database available in JSON format through different URLs in the API. And we'll work with this more next semester, as well as the semester after. So by the time you graduate, you guys are comfortable both at building APIs and also consuming and integrating APIs. Because, as we talked about earlier, this is kind of how a lot of, especially large applications, work. There's all this JSON data moving back and forth. So we need to be able to build our own JSON APIs, and we need to be able to consume other APIs. So we can call them and get responses back and then interpret those responses so we know what behavior, what actions to take. I'm going to push everything up to GitHub. Help if I could spell. So we have Recaptcha plus games. So this is sort of our first kick at playing around with APIs. But as I said, we'll be doing more of these in the coming school year. So there's our completed simple JSON API in PHP. Are there any questions from anybody before we wrap up for today? Probably in a simple form, Colton, yes. It won't be a big part of the exam, but maybe something kind of like the weather API, which is pretty simple, right? Go to the website, copy and paste. Or I may ask you to generate a simple API. It wouldn't be as complicated as Recaptcha, but I might ask you to either consume a simple API or to build a simple API like we've done here. And this slide deck, it's on Blackboard. It's in the lesson 12 folder here. These lesson 12 slides. So you have reference to this. And of course, you can read any of these, use any of these materials during the exam as well. There's also a little quick video here. I didn't show this. Sorry, here's a little tutorial. Also kind of an intro to APIs. Good reference. A little bit where they talk about a lot of the same things, even though it's a bit old. They talk about a lot of the same things we've talked about, like data formats, JSON and XML. So there's some nice samples here. It's pretty easy to read, some useful diagrams. So this tutorial is a good resource. They talk about authentication with headers and things like that, using keys. So like Spotify uses a key, just like Google does. Something like this. Are there any other questions from anybody for today? All the code from today is up on GitHub, so feel free to reference it. I will get the videos uploaded a little bit later today as well for today's lesson.